The trade market in the NHL right now is whisper quiet. Yes, the Colorado Avalanche made a couple of moves and totally overhauled their goaltending over the last couple of weeks, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But right now, there aren't a lot of big names on the market, and there aren't even a lot of big names that we're projecting to be on the market as the year goes on, and that's because of a couple of reasons. First, in the Eastern Conference, it's a lot of mush. The top of the conference is just a bunch of teams who are all kind of in the same kind of tier. Then there's the bottom, which is teams like Montreal and Columbus. And then there's that group in the middle where they either think they can be playoff teams or they're facing so much pressure to make the playoffs that they're not ready to pull the pin quite just yet. Think of the Buffaloes, the Detroits, the Ottawas. And then you can look in the West where there is this weird mushy middle. There's the bottom of the conference, San Jose, Chicago, Anaheim, teams of that nature who they don't even have that many A-plus assets to sell off. And then there's this top tier, which features a whole bunch of teams with legitimate Stanley Cup dreams. In the Pacific, you have Edmonton and Vegas. Vancouver maybe belongs in that group if they get their stuff sorted out. In the Central, there's a lot. Dallas and Colorado came into this year with Stanley Cup dreams, and teams like Winnipeg and Minnesota, who are 1 and 2 in that division, they are starting to believe that they belong in that group. So there aren't exactly a lot of teams dangling prime trade assets out there. But I think something interesting could be developing over the next couple of months. I know I said that teams like Vancouver and Winnipeg and Minnesota kind of sort of belong in that group. But in my mind, there are 4 teams who are in cup or bust years. Think of it like this. If Minnesota goes to the conference finals or loses in the second round, they probably come out of this year feeling pretty good about themselves. So would Winnipeg, and I think Vancouver would as well. For teams like Edmonton, Vegas, Dallas, and Colorado, if they do not win the Stanley Cup, I think this season is largely viewed as a failure. And that means there's a lot of pressure on these front offices to do everything that they can to give this current team and this current group of players the best chance they can to win the Stanley Cup. And where I think this could trend is into a very interesting arms race come the trade deadline. And that could lead a lot of other teams who maybe don't want to pull the pin or maybe don't want to part with a big name player. They could get offers that they simply can't refuse. And usually contending teams are spent right to the salary cap. And that makes making a move for a player, even a player with term, way more complicated in season. That's why you see trades like that happen at the draft or ahead of free agency when teams have a clear picture of their cap situation and can have a little bit more flexibility. But that could change. A team like Dallas, they have a little bit of cap space. And our friend Jeff Merrick over at Daily Faceoff says the Stars are big game hunting. Jim Nill wants to make a big move. And not only could they have close to $6.5 million in cap space accrued by the deadline, Tyler Seguin's out with hip surgery. And if he stays on the LTIR until playoffs, not only could Dallas spend right around $6 million, they could then dip into the LTIR and use Seguin's $9.8 million cap hit to acquire a legitimate stud. On top of that, Dallas has a great farm system, a bunch of young players who are already contributing in the NHL. If they wanted to make a big swing, they could. And if Dallas is going to make a big swing, you better believe Colorado will be right behind them. Chris McFarland, the Avs GM, after acquiring Mackenzie Blackwood earlier in the week, came out and said, we're not done tinkering. We're not done adding to this team. And while the Avs don't have the same number of assets that a team like Dallas has, here's what they do have. Another player who could potentially go on LTIR. Jesse Montano from Guerrilla Sports out in Colorado says that they should have a clearer picture in the next month or so on what's going to happen with their captain, Gabriel Landeskog. He's been trying to come back from a knee surgery for a while. If the Avs know that he won't be back before the playoffs or perhaps at all this year, that is $7 million of LTIR money that they could potentially use, which brings us to the Oilers. Yes, they're in the Pacific Division, so it is a little bit different. But if Edmonton's sitting there and they know Dallas is big game hunting and Colorado is big game hunting, isn't Edmonton kind of in a similar spot? Right now, if the Oilers can get everyone healthy, there still is time for them to accrue north of $3 million in deadline cap space. That would be absolutely massive for this team when you consider you don't need to work in a guy's full salary cap hit when you acquire them at the deadline. But Edmonton has their own LTIR wrinkle as well. Evander Kane hasn't played yet this year. And earlier in the week, Chris Knobloch said, don't expect to hear any sort of an update on Evander Kane until at least the new year. He said it's going to be a month until they say anything about him. If Evander Kane's going to be back before the start of the before the end of the regular season, Edmonton can't use his money. If Evander Kane's going to be out until the playoffs, Edmonton can use his money. And that all of a sudden gets them into some totally different conversations about who they could acquire. Combine that with the fact that the salary cap could go up more than the projected $4.5 million this summer. And maybe Edmonton starts to feel like they could go after a big name who has some term attached to them as well. These three teams are in very, very unique spots. There's also the Vegas Golden Knights, who we know will always find a loophole or two to make sure they can add at the deadline. These teams are all in very interesting positions if they want to add. And again, right now, there is not a big name out there, but you can go through a couple of those middling teams that I mentioned in the Eastern Conference and start to point at a few guys and go, Pittsburgh, if things get really desperate, what are you willing to move off? Which veterans are you willing to trade away to try to kickstart some sort of a retooling period so you can try to be competitive one more time before the end of Sidney Crosby's career? If you're Lou Lamoriello out on Long Island, yes, they have Brock Nelson, who's probably going to be one of the most, if not the most sought after rentals on the market. But if things get ugly in Long Island, and it's kind of trending that way, does another forward, maybe one with term, start to shake loose? If for the Oilers, could it be a defenseman? Maybe someone who's similar to the year the Oilers got Ekholm, we're not even thinking about right now. That is entirely a possibility. There could be an arms race coming in the Western Conference, and there are 4 teams who could potentially have a very unique opportunity in front of them. You're going to want to keep it locked on Oilers Nation and Daily Faceoff, because even though everything is quiet right now, I think more than one of those teams is going to start to get the itch to make a massive splash and make a big trade to add to their lineup. What's up, Nation citizens? If you like that video, then you need to be subscribed to the Oilers Nation YouTube. Podcasts, live shows, exclusive interviews, and analysis. Everything you need from your favorite voices at Oilers Nation. And you don't want to miss any of it, so hammer that subscribe button.